Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this video, we will discuss about PLSQL, Dynamic SQL. So we will start. About Dynamic SQL. Dynamic SQL is a programming methodology for generating and running SQL statements at runtime. It is useful when writing general purpose and flexible programs like ad hoc query systems, when writing programs that must run database definition language statements, or when you do not know at compile time the full text of a SQL statement or the number or data type of its input and output variables. PLSQL provides two ways to write dynamic SQL. One is native dynamic SQL, a PLSQL language that is native feature for building and running dynamic SQL statements. DBMS_SQL package, an API for building, running and describing dynamic SQL statements. Native dynamic SQL code is easier to read and write than equivalent code that uses the DBMS_SQL package and runs noticeably faster, especially when it can be optimized by the compiler. However, to write native dynamic SQL code, you must know at compile time the number and data types of the input and output variables of the dynamic SQL statements. If you do not know this information at compile time, you must use the DBMS_SQL package. You must also use the DBMS_SQL package if you want a stored subprogram to return a query result implicitly, not through an outref cursor parameter. When you need both the DBMS_SQL package and native dynamic SQL, you can switch between them using the DBMS_SQL .to_ref cursor function and DBMS_SQL .to_cursor_number function. When you need dynamic SQL. In PLSQL, you need dynamic SQL to run SQL whose text is known at compile time. For example, a select statement that includes as an identifier that is unknown at compile time, such as a table name or a where clause in which the number of subclauses is unknown at compile time. SQL that is not supported at static SQL, that is any SQL construct not included in the description of static SQL. If you do not need any dynamic SQL, use static SQL, which has advantages like successful compilation verifies that static SQL statements reference valid database objects and that the necessary privileges are in place to access those objects. Successful compilation creates schema object dependencies for now we will discuss about native dynamic SQL. Native dynamic SQL processes most dynamic SQL statements with the execute immediate statement. If the dynamic SQL statement is a select statement that returns multiple rows, native dynamic SQL gives you these choices. Use the execute immediate statement with the bulk collect into clause. Use the open, for, or fetch and close statements. The SQL cursor attributes work the same way after native dynamic SQL, insert, update, delete, merge and single row select statements as they do for their static SQL counterparts. Execute immediate statement. The execute immediate statement is the means by which native dynamic SQL processes most dynamic SQL statements. If the dynamic SQL statement is self-contained, that is, if it has no placeholders for bind variables and the only result that it can possibly return is an error, then the execute immediate statement needs no clauses. If the dynamic SQL statement includes placeholders for bind variables, each placeholder must have a corresponding bind variable in the appropriate clause of the execute immediate statement. As follows: if the dynamic SQL statement is a select statement that can return at most one row, put out bind variable defines in the into clause and in bind variables in the using clause. If the dynamic SQL statement is a select statement that can return multiple rows, put outbound variables defines in the bulk collect into clause and in bind variables in the using clause. If the dynamic SQL statement is a DML statement without a returning into clause, put in bind variables in the using clause and in the using clause. If the dynamic SQL statement is a DML statement with the returning into clause, put in bind variables in the using clause and out bind variables in the returning into clause. If the dynamic SQL statement is an anonymous PLSQL block or a call statement, put all bind variables in the using clause. If the dynamic statement invokes a subprogram, ensure that the subprogram is either created at schema level or declared and defined in a package specification. Every bind variable that corresponds to a placeholder for a subprogram parameter has the same parameter mode as the subprogram parameter and a data type that is compatible with that of the subprogram parameter. No bind variable is the reserved word null. To work around this restriction, use an uninitialized variable where you want to use null. No bind variable has a data type that SQL does not support as an associative array indexed by string. If the data type is a collection or record type, then it must be declared in a package specification. Bind variables can be evaluated in any order if the program determines order of evaluation. Then, at the point where the program does so, its behavior is unidentified. Now we will see the example invoking subprogram from dynamic PL/SQL block. In this example, the dynamic PL/SQL block is an anonymous PL/SQL block that invokes a subprogram created at schema level. You can see the example, its procedure. Okay. In this one is the simple subprogram that dynamic PL/SQL block invokes. Now in this example we can see the dynamic PL/SQL block. Here in PL/SQL underscore block variable we are storing PL/SQL commands. You can see the first line, and then specify bind variables in using clause, specify mode for first parameter, modes of other parameters are corrected by default, like execute immediate PL/SQL block, because this one is storing our PL/SQL block, using in, out, new department ID, new department name, new manager ID, new location ID. So here you saw how you can use dynamic PL/SQL block. In this example with Boolean parameter, dynamic invoking subprogram with Boolean parameter. In this example we are just passing the Boolean parameter to the PL/SQL block, and you can see the result should be X. You can run this in your test environment. Dynamic invoking subprogram with record parameter, record formal parameter. In this example, the dynamic PL/SQL block is an anonymous PL/SQL block that invokes a subprogram that has a formal parameter of the PL/SQL block but not SQL. Data type record. The record type is declared in a package specification, and the subprogram is declared in the package specification and defines in the package body. This, okay, and in package body it is defined here, and here we can call it procedure. P is, we are calling in it is dynamic PL/SQL. Hope you understand this and you can test in your test environment. The other example is dynamic invoking subprogram with associated array formal parameter. In this example, the dynamic PL/SQL block is an anonymous PL/SQL block that invokes a subprogram that has a formal parameter of the PL/SQL collection type associative array indexed by PLS integer. An associated array type used in this context must be indexed by PLS integer. As you can see here, it is indexed by PLS integer. So you can see how we can pass array to the variable in dynamic invoking subprogram. In this example, we are looking at open, for, fetch, and close statements. If the dynamic SQL statement represents a select statement that returns multiple rows, you can process it with native dynamic SQL. Use an open for statement to associate a cursor variable with the dynamic SQL statement. In the using clause of the open for statement, specify a bind variable for each placeholder in the dynamic SQL statement. The using clause cannot contain the literal null. To work around this restriction, use an uninitialized variable where you want to use null. Use the fetch statement to retrieve result, set rows one at a time, several at a time, or all at once. Use the close statement to close the cursor variable. The dynamic SQL statement can query a collection if the collection meets the criteria in querying a collection. So in this example, you can see this example lists all employees who are managers retrieving result set rows once at a time. You can see dynamic SQL statement with placeholder here, and then open cursor and specify bind variables in a using clause, and here you can see fetch rows from result set one at a time. Now we will discuss dbms underscore SQL package. The dbms underscore SQL package defines an entity called the SQL cursor number. Because the SQL cursor number is a PLSQL integer, you can pass it across call boundaries and store it. You must use the dbms underscore SQL package to run a dynamic SQL statement if any of the following are true. You do not know the select list until runtime. You do not know until runtime what placeholders in a select or DML statements must be bound. You want a stored subprogram to return a query result implicitly, not through an outref cursor parameter, which requires the dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure. In these situations, you must use native dynamic SQL instead of the dbms underscore SQL package. The dynamic SQL statement retrieves rows into records. You want to use the SQL cursor attribute cursor found. This is percent sign. Percent sign is open, percent not found, or percent row count. After issuing a dynamic SQL statement that is an insert, update, delete, merge, or single row select statement. When you need both the dbms underscore SQL package and native dynamic SQL, you can switch between them using the function dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore ref cursor and dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore cursor number. dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure. The dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure lets a stored subprogram return a query result implicitly to either the client program, which invokes the subprogram indirectly, or the immediate caller of the subprogram. After dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result returns the result, only the recipient can access it. The dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result has two overloads. Procedure return underscore result bracket RC in out sys underscore ref cursor comma to underscore client in boolean default true. And same like this, another which you can mention RC in out integer, remaining to client in boolean default true. The RC parameter is either an open cursor variable sys underscore ref cursor or the cursor number integer of an open cursor. To open a cursor and get its cursor number, invoke the dbms underscore SQL dot open underscore cursor function. When the to underscore client parameter is true, the default, the dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure returns the query result to the client program, which invokes the subprogram indirectly. When this parameter is false, the procedure returns the query result to the subprogram's immediate caller. Now we will see the example dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure. In this example, the procedure P invokes dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result without the optional to underscore client parameter, which is true by default. Therefore, dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result returns the query result to the subprogram client, the anonymous block that invokes P. After P returns a result to the anonymous block, only the anonymous block can access that result. You can copy this, and or you have to type, as this is a video, you cannot copy. You can run this in your test environment and you can see, as I told you, P cannot access the result. Here it is mentioning in the comments, after P returns a result to the anonymous block, only the anonymous block can access the result. So result will be this. dbms underscore SQL dot get underscore next result procedure. The dbms underscore SQL dot get underscore next underscore result procedure gets the next result that the dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure returns to the recipient. The two procedures return results in the same order. The dbms underscore SQL dot get underscore next underscore result has two overloads. One is procedure get underscore next underscore result C in integer RC out sys underscore ref cursor, and same get next result C in integer here RC out integer. The C parameter is the cursor number of an open cursor that directly or indirectly invokes a subprogram that uses the dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result procedure to return a query result implicitly. To open a cursor and get its cursor number, invoke the dbms underscore SQL dot open underscore cursor function. dbms underscore SQL dot open cursor has an optional parameter treat underscore as underscore client underscore for underscore results. When this parameter is false, which is default, the caller that opens this cursor to invoke a subprogram is not treated as the client that receives query results for the client from the subprogram that uses dbms underscore SQL dot return underscore result. Those query results are returned to the client in an upper tier instead. When this parameter is true, the caller is treated as the client. For more information about the dbms underscore SQL dot open underscore cursor function, you can see the documentation of Oracle, or if you have any book. The RC parameter is either a cursor variable sys underscore ref cursor or the cursor number integer or an open cursor. So in the next example, the procedure get underscore employee info uses dbms underscore SQL dot return result to return two query results to a client program and is invoked dynamically by the anonymous block main, because main block needs to receive the two query results that get employee info returns. Main opens a cursor to invoke get underscore employee underscore info using dbms underscore SQL dot open underscore cursor with the parameter treat as client for result set to true. Therefore, dbms underscore SQL dot get underscore next underscore result returns its result to main, which uses the cursor rc to fetch them. So you can see this example code, and again you can test in your environment if you like. I explained already how it will work and how it will give you result. Here you can see in example the result is also mentioning. Now we will see on we will look at dbms underscore SQL to ref cursor function. The dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore ref cursor function converts a SQL cursor number to a weak cursor variable, which you can use in native dynamic SQL statements. Before passing a SQL cursor number to the dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore ref cursor function, you must open, parse, and execute it, otherwise an error occurs. After you convert a SQL cursor number to a ref cursor variable, dbms underscore SQL operations can access it only the ref cursor variable, not as the SQL cursor number. For example, using the dbms underscore SQL dot is open function to see if a converted SQL cursor number is still open causes an error. In this example, you can see dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore ref cursor function to switch from the dbms SQL package to native dynamic SQL. So you can see here they are defining array. One is array, one is num list, is table of number. And next we can see all the example to converting to native dynamic SQL. Here you can see this word switch from dbms SQL to native dynamic SQL. This would cause an error because cursor ID was converted to a ref cursor. Now we will see on dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore cursor underscore number function. The dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore cursor underscore number function converts a ref cursor variable, either strong or weak, to a SQL cursor number, which you can pass to the dbms underscore SQL subprogram. Before passing a ref cursor variable to the dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore cursor number function, you must open it. After you convert a ref cursor variable to a SQL cursor number, native dynamic SQL operations cannot access it. So in this example, uses the dbms underscore SQL dot to underscore cursor number function to switch from native dynamic SQL to the dbms underscore SQL package. So you can see this example switching from native dynamic SQL to dbms underscore SQL package. I think no need to more define it, as remarks are there. You can see switch from native dynamic SQL to dbms SQL package. Here you are defining columns. Here fetch rows with dbms underscore SQL package. And here you can write your any other statements if you want to write. So this was it. Thank you very much for listening, and hope it will help you to understand the dynamic SQL and the native SQL and the execute immediate function as it was with examples. So hopefully it will be very helpful. Thank you again, and we will meet again in any other new topic.